All right, excited? No? Yeah? Woo-hoo. You know what? This is going to be an interesting conversation. So I did have the Oilers logo on this. I guess this will go on the recording, but I decided to take it off just because I had a couple of comments that maybe I don't have the copyright for the Oilers logo. But the point is that this is going to be really focused on where we should be going. So, Wayne Gretzky had always said, you got to go where the puck is going, not where it's being. And I think defenders have to start thinking like that as well. And so if you look at a lot of the different organizations, there's a lot of similarities, right? There's some nuance, right? So healthcare, they care about patient care, right? Being able to provide patient care. They, they don't want malware in their organization that could jeopardize that patient care and potentially death. And I think we've started seeing some of that. Unfortunately, they have personal health information that they want to protect. And, industrial environments, very similar, right? They don't care about patients, but they care about safety and not having to send somebody as a patient to a healthcare organization. So human risk becomes a big factor. You've got financial institutions that, care about payment processing. So any cyber event that impacts even milliseconds, right, or nanoseconds could jeopardize their ability to make money. And so that's obviously something that is top of mind for them, as well as personal identifiable information and things like that. And I'm coming to a point here, right? Higher education. So again, they might care about compromised research data, right? They're working on research. They don't want it compromised and leaked. Obviously, PII, intellectual property, is something of interest to them as well to protect. And then government, right? You might have critical services, classified data. Again, you get into PII and intellectual property and things like that. But you know what? When I did a bunch of research, so I probably spent about 2.5 weeks trying to figure out what are the real threat vectors that customers are facing today. And then I analyzed that, cross-referenced it, looked at a bunch of data points, came out, and these are like the top 10. Or I used ChatGPT. So, right? I said, tell me the top 10. So yeah, I didn't spend any time. But we don't tell our employers that, right? We say exactly what I did is the effort involved. But anyways, advanced phishing, ransomware, social engineering, like these haven't changed. Maybe the new one is around AI threats, right? People are starting to build models in their organization, and so there's a new threat vector. A lot of the same controls, but there is some new things, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Vulnerabilities are being exploited, right? Supply chain attacks, these are all things that happen. The problem is that no matter how much effort you put in, you're never going to get 100% security effectiveness 100% of the time. I hate to tell you, right? You're gonna get popped. And when you get popped, obviously there's things the adversary is going to do. And that's really what the focus is, right? So we've got preventative capabilities. And if you look at just ransomware, there's tremendous opportunity as a defender to mitigate against that, right? You can do DNS layer protection, web proxy, next generation firewall, email, endpoint protection, right? And some people might say, well, wait, we've got really good endpoint protection. Do I need all these other controls? And absolutely you do, right? And these are the basics. Everybody has these or should have these. The point of relying on one control is that if at any point in time that control fails, right, you better hope that you have something in place to mitigate, especially on the endpoint, right? That's your last opportunity to defend. And then as you go along, there might be things that you need to do from ransomware specifically, like sandboxing, right? Detonate that in a malware environment or in an environment where we can look for behaviors to identify risk because it's unknown. And then you get a disposition. But also there's other things that you can do that may not prevent, but identify threats in the organization, like ransomware, right? You got network detection and response, right? Baselining an environment. This is one of the defender's greatest opportunity is to baseline your environment, truly understand what normal looks like. So if there's deviations of that environment at any point in time, obviously with some logic, you can identify something in the environment. And most times when you're identifying it here is a good indicator your controls have failed, right? And they will. So again, it's just an opportunity. And then you look at workload protection, NAC on the campus infrastructure, wired, wireless, and VPN. Again, these are things that I can stop maybe potentially some of the things the adversary has to do in order to get successful. I can get one user to open up an attachment potentially and click on it, right? That's easy. But spreading it and causing harm in the organization, that's harder, right? And then obviously you'd overlay, and we're just talking ransomware. So go through the top 10, these are things that you're thinking about, right? Like what can I put in place to mitigate that threat? So as we go along, when we look at it, an adversary might start with ransomware. And there's a common theme here, and we're gonna come to that in a second. But if you look at an anatomy of an attack, you have to get initial access somehow, right? Get you to click or pop a vulnerability or something, right? That has to happen. And then once they land, right, they're gonna do a bunch of things around the techniques that they need in order to, make their presence known in the organization, or unknown at first until known if it's ransomware, and maybe unknown forever because they're stealing intellectual property. They're not looking necessarily to cause harm. So if you look at MITRE, the attack framework, you've got things like tactics and techniques, right? Tactics is the high-level bucket of what I'm trying to achieve, and the technique is the thing that I need to do in order to achieve that tactic, right? And so you got execution, persistence, privilege escalation, defense evasion. All of these are, opportunities for defenders: credential access, discovery, lateral movement, collections, command and control. I'm a big believer of the MITRE attack framework, right? We have NIST, we have all these other frameworks you're gonna follow, but tell me one organization that followed any one of those frameworks that have not been compromised. You can't, right? Same thing. If you've got 50 different technologies and you've done a really good job integrating it and you've matured the platform, tell me one organization that hasn't been compromised. You can't, right? Eventually they will. But if you take an adversarial view of it, you have an opportunity to do things a little bit differently. You don't need to be right 100% of the time in every step. What you need to be right is in certain aspects of the attack. Now, obviously, earlier on, the better, right? If I know it's going to a bad domain and I can block it right out of the gate, that's probably pretty good. The reality is that the adversary is going to get past that control. And when they do, what is their next step? So if I understand the vertical that I'm in, and how adversaries maybe target that vertical and map that out to their capabilities, now I start building, assuming breach, so assuming compromise is inevitable, and now I can start overlaying the opportunity for defenders, or protection, right? Or defenders, but prevention and detection. Not everything's gonna be prevented 100% of the time, and detection you need in order to prevent, but you don't always have an ability to prevent. That's a reality. And so I'm just mapping this out. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but again, I'm just talking about capabilities aligned to the tactic, and in this case, the technique that the adversary is using. And I'm saying these are things I can do, like EDR technology, right? A lot of these first pieces, execution, persistence, privilege, defense evasion, well, maybe, but credential access, is a lot of endpoint stuff, right? So you can do a lot of endpoint-based controls there. But I probably want to stop it earlier. And then you get into things like discovery. Well, guess what? You need a network to discover, right? You need that transport to be able to use that. So things like network detection response, that's an opportunity to detect things. Lateral movement, collections, command and control, exfiltration, and then finally impact, right? Ransomware has landed, right? It's encrypted the drive and now you're making a payment, or maybe not, right? What do you think's common here that we continue to miss as defenders? What do you think is the number one area of opportunity we still are really crappy at doing? Anyone? Security awareness. Yeah, I don't know that we're gonna get better at that, to be honest. Right, there's programs in place, sure, some organizations are in different journeys of that to do better. But it is a good point, but I don't know that we're gonna get more effective there. I just don't think that's gonna happen. But you have to do it. It's like endpoint protection. You just gotta do it. Yeah, those are two good ones. But if they land and you can't prevent that escalation, then what? What's the adversary going to do almost every time? Once they pop a box, so they defeated the control, what is it that they're going to do every single time? Yes, whoever said that, yeah. Lateral movement, right? Almost and again, it's 60 to 70% of all breaches involve lateral movement. That's the number. I was surprised by that number. I thought it'd be a lot higher, but maybe if the adversary lands and they weren't able to expand, that doesn't, so that 30% was you had a control in place that didn't allow the adversary to successfully move forward. But no adversary lands on an asset and says, I hit the jackpot, game over, I win, right? They need to break out of that system every single time, whether it's in the campus infrastructure, on an endpoint user, an IoT-based device, or a workload vulnerability in the data center. It's inevitable. And so the common theme that I see is in fact lateral movement. And you might say, well, wait a minute, Jason's got a little Cisco thing in the back, and they have the network. And no, I'm talking about, when I talk about lateral movement, I'm talking about lateral movement more holistically. So I'm talking about from the campus, whether you're IoT, HR, IT, whatever, stopping lateral movement within the campus infrastructure, but also mitigating risk in the workload environment. And I'll show you that in a second. So when you look at this, you have a lot of stuff on there. Look at the plug for Cyber Alberta. Martin will be proud. But the campus infrastructure, you've got lots of devices, right? It's pretty messy. A lot of IoT devices connected to the environment. You can't put an endpoint product on every single asset that you have in the environment. The adversary knows that, right? They know you have IoT-based devices and they're targeting them. And they're using that to pivot more within the organization. And so when you look at the campus infrastructure, there's a couple of core elements that you absolutely require. Doesn't matter what technology that you're buying, it has to do some of these things. One is provide visibility, right? You need to holistically see what the assets are in the organization, right? Or else you can't prevent it. So that's the first thing. Then you need to build policy. The policy is going to hopefully drive a zero trust outcome, meaning that connectivity from this asset to this asset can't happen, even in a layer 2 network, right? We're not even going through a router. We're talking even on the layer 2 boundary. So for example, you might have all these users in the same switch on the same layer 2 network. Well, if ransomware gets on one of them, they have free access typically to spread in that environment. I want to stop that. We should stop that. A bit of work to make that happen. But you want to build policy, and the biggest piece of this is because you touch the network, there's a tremendous amount of noise and risk, right? So if you put in a control and it breaks, guess what? Help desk, it lights up, and we don't want that. So you want to have an ability to simulate. So find a way to be able to prove policy out and the outcomes, and then move to enforcement at that point in time. That helps us drive towards zero trust. But zero trust doesn't mean no access, right? Zero trust means limited access. Now, what if this switch here, all these people are on the same layer 2 network, need a peer-to-peer type application to function? It happens. You're not going to shut down the business. They still need to do peer-to-peer stuff, right? Collaborate or whatever it might be. So you have to allow that access, right? If not, you just unplug everything and say it's secure. We all know that, right? So you can't do that. So what happens if malware takes advantage of that, as an example? Or an adversary, forget malware, just say an adversary gets on it and starts probing and taking advantage of that port that's open. Well, you can't stop that, right? That's where other controls hopefully come in. But I could proactively build policy that says what happens if I do assume breach and they're able to move within that environment. Could I push a button and send controls into that environment and mitigate that as we kick the adversary out, right? Once we understand where the adversary is, we secure the environment, then we open that back up. We should be able to do that. These are things that we should be doing in the industry, but it's been difficult to do this, right? And it should be based on some level of risk. Right? We want to identify the asset. And when I say an asset or identity, identity is more than just a user, right? It's a machine. It's the context of the risk profile associated to the user. It's the context and risk profile associated to the machine. And then the overall risk profile, right? All of that matters. And then if there's CVEs in the organization, we may want to add additional controls, right? And mitigate against it. And the goal here is to stop what I said earlier, that lateral movement, or make it very, very difficult. And I'm a big believer of this, right? You do not need defensive capabilities in 100% of the places. You just need to make it sticky, slow it down. And I call this time-based defense. And the reason why I call it time-based defense is that if there is a port open or the user has access to something and they ride along that access, hopefully they try something that they don't have access to. And what's that gonna do? It creates noise. If it creates noise, guess what? Any one of your other technologies may pick it up. So it gives your team more time and your products more time to catch the adversary in the environment. Because think about it, they're in a box and they're just pounding the box trying to figure out how to get out, right? You're making it noisy for them. And noise is a benefit to us as defenders. Now, what about the data center? Now, I'll go on record saying this. This is the greatest opportunity I think defenders have, but we ignore it because of the complexity. I'm not saying EDR and XDR and your email security and next-gen fire aren't important. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is if you can focus on one area that provides the greatest amount of risk reduction, this is the area. Because again, the campus, tremendously valuable, right? If I can stop lateral movement, but they're gonna pop a user, we know that. Is that where they wanna stay? Probably not, right? They wanna get here. They wanna get in the data center environment. And so what we wanna make sure that we're doing is again, very same thing. These workloads could be containers. How many people have protection mechanisms in their container environment, right? There's a whole virtual, when you talk about virtual networks, containers have a whole other world of virtualization inside of that. And most of those micro apps have access to each other, and there's no additional controls in that environment, at least by default. You've got Linux, you've got Windows, you've got AIX, you've got Solaris, you got security groups in Azure, NSG groups, well, in Azure, security groups in AWS, right? They all have a different nomenclature. Their API works a little bit differently. But they all have a control in that environment. And up to now, this has been very difficult. Like anybody that's managed firewalls know this, right? App team or a business group has said, listen, new service coming online, we need to turn on this service. These are the ports and protocols we are doing a change request for. And then you go in and do that heavy lift, type it all in, and then make the change. You do your internal testing, you pass it to their UAT team, and they come back and say, it kind of works, but doesn't work. And that's at the edge of the data center, right? Or at an internet firewall as an example, right? And then you go, well, tell me what the app needs. I can make the change, that part's easy. And they don't know the app. And then you do a little bit of conversation, come back, you guys make additional changes. Again, it kind of works better than it did before, but not fully works. And you're like, now you're doing packet captures, right? You're trying to figure out what does this application need? And so people don't touch that workload environment. It's too complicated, right? You break stuff here, things go bad. So you want to be able to do very much the same thing. You want to be able to take the information from the systems in the organization, whether it's container, security group, network, operating system, take that data, ingest it, run AI against it, and build policy automatically for you. That's a reality. And not only do you want to build policy, but you want to simulate it before you make the change of enforcement. Because if you don't, that's where you're going to get calls. And most likely in this case, like you can block out a user, but you start blocking the workload itself. And workload, just because sometimes the terminal workload equals server, right? Whatever service that you're providing. Obviously, then you're probably going to look for a new job, right? So if you are looking, this is a good way to accelerate that, if you want. And then there's some really interesting stuff that we're starting to see in the industry, like exploit protection. I'm going to talk a little bit about this, but imagine being able to say, listen, here's a high-risk vulnerability that I can't patch because we're in the high seasons of transaction for whatever. Maybe it's, Boxing Day, right? In your retail, you don't want to go in but if there's a vulnerability, high risk, right? Maybe you can do rolling updates, but maybe you can't. Can I mitigate against that? And this is where the industry is kind of evolving. We're going to talk about that in a second. And risk profiles. And then, it goes on, right? Like, again, if we talk about accessing private applications, well, again, when you access an application, you want visibility, you got to build policy, you got to do enforcement, right? Only allow them access to the things they access and nothing more. You want to drive towards zero trust. Again, some level of risk, maybe around identity and machine all coming together. And then maybe if something does change, you want to step up authentication. So for example, if you're a healthcare organization, you're a big organization, you have, a Tim Hortons. Tim Hortons has their own Wi-Fi in their organization. Well, you're a doctor, you go down for a Timmy's, right? You have access to patient care data. You walk into Timmy's, it automatically connects to the Wi-Fi. Well, should you lose access to that app? Maybe, right? And if you don't, because the condition of the environment changes, then you might want to step up authentication, right? Now we're going to add friction to the environment. The goal as practitioners is to remove the friction, add the security. You know when you go in an airport, how much friction is that, right? You go up to the till, you show them a ticket, you show them your ID, you know, they say, go ahead, then you put the bag on because you're checking it in. It's going through a whole bunch of security controls that you don't see. Then you go up to security and you're taking everything off. Then if you're lucky enough, they say, come over here, right? And they do additional validation, right? Wipe your laptop, check it for whatever they're checking it for. And then if you're going to the US and you're in customs here in Canada, guess what? You get to go up and they're asking you probably even more questions. Where you're going, where you're staying, how long you're gonna be, are you leaving, right? And then if you're lucky, I guess again, you get to go into secondary and then they say, are you sure? And you're like, I was running from the airport. That's why I'm trying to catch my flight. I'm dripping sweat. I might've looked nervous, but I'm not nervous, right? Like I'm just trying to catch my flight. That's all friction based, right? It's a garbage experience for users. Huh? That's a good point. But I don't mind the attention. Anyways, but the point on our side is we don't want any of that. We want the same level of scrutiny, right? We want all those same things. We want to scan packets. We want to look for malware. We want to do all those things, but we don't want the friction, right? That's not a good thing. And then the operational environment, very much the same thing, right? I'm not changing anything. Visibility, policy, simulation, enforcement, zero trust, right? And now we start to take these off in sections and we start building more of a holistic zero trust outcome. You're not gonna have a single product or technology that drives the outcome. It's gonna be a collection of capabilities that drives towards the framework, not the products, that drive the outcome, right? But we wanna make it operationally as simple as possible, wherever we can. So you're gonna start hearing this theme around hybrid mesh firewall, right? That's an industry, Gartner created it, and this is now focusing more on that data center workload, the biggest opportunity for defenders, right? Go where the puck is going. That's where the adversary is gonna go, right? They're going to your workloads. That's what they're gonna compromise. So maybe we need to get there first, right? And intercept it. And so applications are highly distributed. We talked a little bit about that. We don't trust anything. Period. Even when we do trust it, then we're running intrusion prevention against the packets we do trust, right? And then vulnerabilities are coming faster and faster. And so the goal is to leverage that ecosystem of capabilities. So you might have a firewall. That firewall could be deployed in an organization. There's a bunch of capabilities that come with it. That's going to remove some risk, right? And so think about every dot here. These dots represent where controls could be put in place. And again, I'm not talking about a vendor-specific outcome here. I'm talking about a capability-driven outcome. Same thing with Secure Services Edge or SSE or SASE, right? There's a whole firewall as a service within that service. So now I've got my next-gen firewall. I've also got this firewall as a service. I might also have security groups in the data center or in Azure, GCP, AWS. I might want to transition that to be more full-fledged security appliance, right? So probably PaaS device that can grow with the environment and build in advanced inspection, like intrusion, malware, TLS decrypt, quick proxy, things like that. And that's going to be in places. And then you've got workloads, Linux, AIX, Windows, all these containers, right? Docker, Kubernetes, all of these have controls in it. Most people in this room, nobody touches this piece, right? Like how many people, and I won't ask this because you don't need to put up your hands, but I suspect, unless you just yell and say you're wrong, I'm okay with that. But most of us aren't running firewall services on Microsoft Windows in the Windows environment or firewall services in Linux in a workload environment or a data center environment. You're just not, because it's hard to determine what the application requires to function. So you don't do it. So this could be, 100 workloads. I've got a customer in my real job that has 30,000, 40,000 workloads, like massive. Imagine trying to do that there, never mind 100. But the scope of this is like, it could be this big, right? It's very, very hard to do. And then you've got containers. So this is Docker, Kubernetes, as I mentioned, or OpenShift. Like all of those technologies now have that whole world inside them, again, delivering a control. And the thing that us as defenders got to start to think about, how much skill set do I have to bring in? Like now you're saying I need a Windows firewall admin, I need a Linux firewall admin. Maybe they're the same people, but containers and platform engineering, that's a different group. And then I've got my cloud team over here that does the security groups. I've got my next gen firewall team back here that manages, Apollo, a Checkpoint, Cisco, whatever it might be, right? And you think it can't get much more complicated than that. Well, what about eBPF, right? Open source capability, right? Everybody familiar with eBPF? Kind of no, not really. So eBPF is really a sandboxed environment that's in the kernel by default on Linux and containers. So what it allows us to do is see every system function call that takes place at the kernel level with full visibility without ever breaking the kernel and blue screening the box. So everything goes through this sandboxed environment, and now I can see every process, every function call, everything. And I can do some really interesting stuff with that. And eBPF is open source, and it's coming to Windows. So today it's in Linux, and it's in all the container platforms, and it's coming to Windows as well. So a tremendous opportunity here to understand security and networking and observability at the kernel level without having the risk of a new security update that comes into the platform that happens to touch the kernel that blue screens to death, or blue screen. I think they changed the color, did they? I saw something. Is the black screen to death? Like they didn't think we can change blue from black, right? And it's not even that hard. I mean, the first letter is the same. Anyways, eBPF allows us to drive some of that security function. And imagine being able to, and this is future thinking, is taking the DPU in a switch or in a network card on a server and being able to drive an L3, L4 based control with low latency in a data center. And if you wrap it around with some intelligence to tell you what the policy is. If I need to build a policy, do I need to figure it out? Does the application team need to figure it out? Who figures it out? Well, why not let the technology determine based on the connectivity that it requires to tell me what the policy is? And listen, why not even do that without the complexity of knowing the nuance of how to operate it on all of those different technologies? And that's the shift. This is where we're starting to see the transition in the market to allow us to do things that we could never do, especially in the data center environment. And this includes, or should include, third party. Cisco could be third party. It could be Palo, it could be Fortinet, right? The customer determines, right? The user determines what's first party, right? But the bottom line is that you have one or more security or traditional firewalls in the environment, and you're managing them independently. And that's convoluted and complicated, right? And again, how many people do you need to bring in to drive and support that? Maybe it's the same team, but they're probably going to be overburdened, and I bet money that they're not going to be able to do some of the things that you probably should be doing from a risk reduction perspective, right? Like, yeah, you could take care of all of our firewalls. Maybe there's some switch controls that we can drive, but workloads, Windows and Linux, no, we're just not going there. Well, again, that's where the adversary is going. So the point here is if we don't do this, time and time again, this is what happens. And it's going to continue to happen. And again, I'm not saying give up on your other controls. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that we need to go where the puck is going because that's where our enemy is going, right? And it doesn't mean that you're going to have 100% immunity either, right? It doesn't mean that they will not pop a vulnerability. They still might do that. But if you make the box very hard to get out of, well, there's a good chance that you have some advantages here. And so with cloud, we're starting to see that cloud control come to fruition, right? Lots of vendors have the ability to drive controls into an ecosystem, but a lot of times it is very vendor specific. The goal is to remove the friction. This is what you guys all should be pushing your customers or your vendors to start looking at is, listen, I want to be able to control outcomes more broadly, right? And I want to understand the intent. So if I, for example, want to deliver a control for a specific service, do I need to know that it's got a Windows firewall, it goes through a security group in Azure, it's got a container, right? It's a Kubernetes environment, and do I have to figure out exactly how many touch points of controls I have to open up to allow that service end-to-end to open up? Or do I drive intent to say I want this service to work and it tells me these are the control points that need to change? That's where the industry needs to go. The other thing that we need to start looking at is leveraging AI to get rid of some of the noise. So decryption is a heavy cost to everybody, but you need it, right? You need it for things that are bad. And so what if you had the ability to do encrypted-based visibility without decrypting the payload? What? Yeah, and if you buy now, no, I'm just kidding. No, but you have the ability to look at multiple different data points of that packet to determine its destination, right? That could be anomaly, the TLS ciphers that are being used, that could be a piece, right? And you take each one of those and then you determine whether or not this is at risk. And if it is, then maybe block it. So some of the things that we're starting to see with AI is 0.6% of flows are actually at high risk. Again, your environment might be higher, another environment might be lower, right? But generally speaking, 1% of traffic is going to be risky. And so those are flows that I can get out right away. Like optimized, you're not going to do any additional analysis, we're going to get rid of it, right? That's the goal. Low risk, roughly 96%. So all the stuff that you're decrypting is very low risk. Again, I'm not saying don't decrypt it. There might be reason to run IPS on some of it, but 96% of flows typically don't require decryption. And your other controls are still going to be in place. That leaves us with less than 4%. That's it. 4% of traffic needs to be decrypted. And decrypted might also mean, TLS proxy, but also quick proxy, right? You need to be able to decrypt both of those as well. But now what you can do is when you start using technologies like machine learning and AI, you can reduce the amount of hardware you require in order to do the decrypt, right? You can get into a smaller form factor, reduce your overall cost, but not sacrifice the level of security that you're getting. We're starting to see this as well with Snort as an example, another open source technology with intrusion prevention. We've added machine learning capabilities to it that now look for anomalies within signatures. So signatures, what you try to do is cast a net. The net's got to be wide enough to catch as much of that exploit as possible, but it can't be too wide, because if it's too wide, then you get false positives and cause disruption, it's bad. So you've got to tune it in a bit, right? The problem with that is now the adversaries are using AI to find the nuances in that signature, as an example, and they're looking for the gaps, and they're targeting the gaps. Well, fine, we'll do the same thing. We'll analyze it, be able to determine what the risk factors are, and dynamically build in those signatures on the fly when we determine that risk. A little bit around AI, and only because this is another hot area that everyone's looking at. AI has two sides of it, right? You've got the user side, and then you've got the application side. The user side is users going to unsanctioned AI applications, like DeepSeek, ChatGPT, things like that, right? That aren't sanctioned, and you're scared about intellectual property and things like that. So you probably want to start controlling access to those types of applications. And then more importantly, the ones that are sanctioned, you probably want to run DLP on it to make sure that they're not putting the Oilers logo in their presentation, right? If they don't have the copyright. So anyways, that's one side of it. The other side of it is really driving towards securing the models in which you're introducing to the environment. So if you're building out models, we want to make sure that there's no data poisoning, there's no prompt engineering, no injection. Like all of those things should be tested and validated, and you should automate the red teaming of those as well, right? So for example, we've done tests specifically around DeepSeek when it initially came out. And this is talking from a different lens, but out of all of the security tests against DeepSeek, how many failed at that time? Almost all of them. And it might even have been 100%. Now, again, I think with a lot of technologies, we move really fast for adoption, and then security comes and wraps around it. The good thing is that everybody now knows that there's a security component to it, and they're starting to shore their capabilities around that. So segmentation, as I mentioned, as we continue to go through, we want to get down to this level, right? So we want to see flow-based is more high level, port, source, destination, allow. It's not great, right? What you want to do is be able to get down to identifying the process that is on the workload that needs to communicate with another workload and the specific process. And if you want, you can add identity to it as well. And that's at the workload level. And that's where you start driving towards microsegmentation. So you're going to have some workloads that you're going to be able to drive 100% of that. And then you're going to have some other workloads where you're not going to be able to do that, right? So if you have a SAP application that communicates 100% throughout the year, and there's a batch cycle once a year, well, that's going to be a little bit harder to get down to deny all at the bottom. But NTP, DNS, domain controllers, you're probably going to be able to do those really, really quick. Not really, really quickly, but quick enough that it identifies those threats. All right. So this is an example of now things starting to come together. Forget the technology name there, right? It could be NAC, right? If I can authenticate and authorize things that attach to my campus infrastructure, including IoT-based devices, and then use that in identity now for controls in my environment, that's pretty good. Now I can say this CAM from Logitech has access to Logitech app, and that's it. And I can actually build that identity into the workload policy that the Logitech system runs on, right? I can build that logic into it. And then on the campus side, the moment they try to communicate with anything else, instead of going all the way through your controls to block it at the workload level, guess where we block it? We block it as close to the asset that's making the communication that isn't allowed to make that communication. Why do we need to pass that traffic all the way back in just to drop it? The goal would be drop it as soon as possible, right? This is an example. You got sales front end, sales back end, a database service. These are all microservices. You can use eBPF as an example to identify and map them out and then build prescriptive-based policy to drive the outcome within that Kubernetes environment. So I have worked with people specifically trying to reduce risk in an environment where they can't patch specific systems. They just can't. There's no patching of it because the system's unsupported. And to build the application or rebuild it, there's hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars. And so what they're doing is fortifying them, right? They're making sure that if they do get compromised, that they can't break out of that system and move further in the environment. And so these are some of the things that you can do. You can start mapping out the web applications, the front end, the database, the back end, the behavior, the file changes, the network flow. You can use all of that good telemetry to build prescriptive-based policy. When I'm saying prescriptive-based policy, I'm saying I don't need to know how it's applied to Windows Firewall. I don't need to know IP tables. I don't need to know eBPF. I don't need to know security groups. I don't care about the APIs different in AWS, right? I don't care. I want the same look and feel. Policies always look similar, right? So I get used to the way it is created, the way I add policy, and then all I do is hit enforce once I've simulated that traffic, right? And I'll show you that in a second. And then if there's deviations, I want to be able to call that out. If there's a deviation of a communication pattern that I didn't map, I should know about it. Now, could it have caused disruption? Yes. If you map this out and you go to a deny all, and batch cycle didn't run, and now it runs, we're going to see it, right? That's, if you don't have technology that helps you see that, we've got a problem, but it will be able to see it, and then we'll rectify it. Now, we don't want to get there, so you probably want to run your policy analysis over a period of time to make sure you catch it. Now, this is interesting, distributed exploit protection. So what we're starting to see in the industry is the ability to look at vulnerabilities, identify true risk. So true risk really means, just a CVE number, 7.5 or 8 to 10. It should be backed by data science to give you a real indicator of the risk to the organization. So set that aside for a minute, but that's critically important, right? We want to prioritize our patch management based on real vulnerabilities, not what if scenarios. Now, what if it is high risk and it's being exploited? In order for it to be exploited, guess what? It needs to write a file to disk, or it needs to run something in memory and then open up a netcat listener on port 8080, whatever it might be. Well, if you're using eBPF, open source, you have the ability to see that. And if you have the ability to see that, now you have the ability to prevent it. So you can actually go and say the vulnerability requires these things. I don't want you to be able to do that thing. So when they make a function or system call to open up that port, it's going to deny them. And you can leave that vulnerable application still running until you patch it. It's not virtual patching. It's a level above that, right? It's looking at the vulnerability and how you expose it and then making sure you can't expose it. You can't take action of it. You still get into memory, right? You execute arbitrary code, but that's it. You can't actually see the results of that. But how do you do that safely? I'm just going to fast because I know we're going. So how do you, the biggest thing, the biggest problem in the data center is being able to drive the controls without disruption. So how do you do that? Well, with eBPF, I said that at the kernel, you have the sandbox. There's lots of ways to simulate, by the way. This is just one way. But with eBPF specifically, you have that sandboxed environment, right? Within the kernel itself that allows you to hook into everything and see all the communications. And it passes through that system, right? And what if I'm able to, and so that's where you'll build your controls. But I don't want to do that because I want to simulate it. So there's near real time and then real time simulation. I'm just going to talk about real time. So what if I take this and create a duplicate? So I have a digital twin of that traffic at all times. Now I can upgrade this, look for the impact. Did it impact memory, CPU, latency? Is the same number of packets passing as it once before? And if it does, then I should be able to transition that shadow data plane or digital twin into the production data plane. It just flips, right? Moves traffic over. I feel confident about it, right? I've upgraded the system. I didn't blue screen, black screen, purple screen, I think is with the SXI. But anyways, I didn't do the bad, right? The same thing can be done with policy deployment. So I run policy against that secondary or digital twin, and I allow it to run through the analysis. And then based on those outcomes, I adjust or move right into enforcement. If I need to adjust, I make the change to the policy, I let it run again, and then I go ahead and move to enforcement. That builds confidence, right? And it helps with adoption. So these are some of the things that we should be looking and pushing for is, driving towards micro-based segmentation, not with complexity, not with private VLANs, right? But simplifying the deployment of microsegmentation in the data center specifically. I'm not just excusing the campus, but if you're gonna pick one, that's where I would put my money on. And then managing it, right? You need some type of controller that can manage some of this stuff. And that's a conversation because you have different technologies, different stacks. You're gonna try to figure out how best to do that. And there's ways to do that, of course. So in conclusion, so I've probably got 3 minutes probably now. They've got big signs, like even a stop sign. I'm not kidding. It just says stop. But so it says stop sign because anyways, lateral movement equals success for the adversary, period. Zero trust is not a single product. Again, microsegmentation is helping you drive towards zero trust, but I think we all got to push back on vendor specific. Zero trust is not a product. Stop, right? It's an outcome that your product can deliver on of the bigger framework, right? Because you got to remember, as soon as COVID hit, and this whole thing around zero trust, that framework, every product just changed. Zero trust, everyone, no advancement in the technology. They all just found a way to spin. Hey, you want zero trust? Look at my identity. You want zero trust? Look at my network. Anyways, end-to-end segmentation is possible. You definitely want the crawl, walk, run approach to anything that you do, especially in the data center, but even in the campus infrastructure, right? You don't want users upset. So visibility, policy, simulation, enforcement, and then finally compliance. That's something that we didn't touch on, but how do you know when you have deviations in policies? Well, things like network detection and response, that tool will tell you, hey, wait a minute, I'm seeing a communication pattern that wasn't there before. And it can let you know. And if you feed that in, then obviously you can find that you are deviated from what you originally thought, and you can make the adjustments as needed. And that's it. That's the power 45-minute hour.